She should have been an easy mark. The mechanic had seen it 100 times before. Elderly woman brings in a car with a minor issue, leaves with an invoice for thousands. It was practically formulaic, routine even. But as Rick Thompson watched the gray-haired woman shuffle away from his garage that morning, he had no idea the game he'd just set in motion. Little did he know that Margaret Willis wasn't just another helpless grandmother. Behind those wire-rimmed glasses and beneath that crown of silver hair was the mind of someone who'd spent 40 years designing vehicle engines for NASA. The invoice she'd just been handed wasn't just expensive, it was impossible. And Margaret Willis wasn't the kind of woman who let impossibilities slide. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is underestimating the person standing right in front of you. For Rick Thompson, owner of Thompson Auto Repair for 15 years, this lesson was about to come crashing down like a poorly mounted engine block. The game had begun, but he didn't know he was already losing. The morning had started like most at Thompson Auto Repair. The smell of motor oil hung heavy in the air as mechanics moved about the garage with practiced efficiency. Rick sat behind the counter, calculator in hand, tallying up yesterday's earnings with a satisfied smirk. Business was booming, especially in a town with an aging population who knew little about modern vehicles. The bell above the door chimed as it swung open, stealing Rick's attention from his morning count. In walked an elderly woman, her steps slow but deliberate. She wore a simple cardigan over a plain blouse, her silver hair neatly pinned back. Nothing about her screamed money or power, just another perfect mark in Rick's predatory eyes. "Good morning," Margaret said, her voice gentle but clear as she approached the counter. "My car's making an unusual noise when I accelerate. Nothing dramatic, just a slight knocking sound. I was hoping someone could take a look today." Her expression was pleasant, unassuming, exactly the kind Rick had built his dishonest fortune exploiting. Rick straightened up, sliding smoothly into the persona he reserved for customers like her. "Of course, ma'am," he replied, voice dripping with artificial concern. "Knocking sounds can indicate serious problems. Could be your timing belt, maybe even your transmission. Lucky you brought it in now. These things can escalate quickly if left unattended." Margaret nodded politely, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes. Something Rick missed entirely. "I just want to be safe," she said, handing over her keys. "It's a 2018 Toyota Camry, not even 30,000 miles on it yet. Should I wait or come back later?" The question was innocent, the trap not yet apparent. "Why don't you leave it with us for the day?" Rick suggested, scribbling her information onto a form. "These diagnostics can take time if we want to be thorough. We close at 6, but I'll call you if we finish earlier." He smiled broadly, already calculating the unnecessary repairs he could tack onto her bill. Margaret thanked him and left without further questions, exactly as Rick had hoped. As soon as she disappeared from view, he chuckled to himself. "Johnson," he called to his lead mechanic, "we've got another easy one. Old lady, newer Camry, claims there's knocking. Let's make sure we find some serious problems, understand?" Johnson nodded with a knowing smirk. He'd played this game plenty of times before. It was practically a science by now. Identify something minor, exaggerate the problem, suggest several expensive and unnecessary repairs. Works every time, especially on older women who came in alone, their eyes wide with automotive intimidation. What neither of them realized was that Margaret Willis wasn't heading home to anxiously await their call. Instead, she walked 2 blocks to the local library, settled at a computer terminal, and began researching the latest diagnostic systems for Toyota vehicles. Her fingers moved with practiced precision over the keyboard, her mind cataloging information with mechanical efficiency. Back at the garage, Johnson had already popped the hood of Margaret's Camry. A quick inspection revealed exactly what she'd described: a minor issue with a loose heat shield causing a slight knocking noise during acceleration. A 10-minute fix, $20 in parts at most. But that wouldn't do, not for Rick's profit margins. "Find anything yet?" Rick asked, hovering behind Johnson, who was shaking his head in mock concern. "Yeah, boss," Johnson replied, straightening up with practiced dismay. "This doesn't look good. That noise she's hearing could be the early signs of camshaft failure. Might need a whole new assembly." Rick couldn't contain his smile. Camshaft assemblies were expensive, the labor hours substantial. Better check the timing chain too, he suggested, barely hiding his glee. And maybe the valve seals. Can't be too careful with these newer models, they're basically computers on wheels. Johnson nodded, the conspiracy between them as thick as the grease on their hands. Across town, Margaret sat in the quiet of the library, methodically reviewing the mechanical schematics for her vehicle. She'd spent decades designing propulsion systems for spacecraft. A car engine was elementary by comparison. When her phone finally rang around 2 o'clock, she was more than prepared for whatever tale Rick Thompson had constructed. "Mrs. Willis?" Rick's voice sounded appropriately grave when she answered. "I'm afraid I have some concerning news about your vehicle. Would you be able to come in so we can discuss the necessary repairs?" The baited hook was cast, his tone suggesting urgency without specifics, a classic tactic to prevent research before the customer arrived. "Of course," Margaret replied, her voice betraying nothing of her preparation. "I can be there in 30 minutes. She gathered her notes, neatly tucking them into her purse before heading back to Thompson Auto Repair. Her pace was unhurried, patient. Engineers understood that timing was everything, in engines and in life. When Margaret walked back into the shop, Rick was waiting with a carefully crafted expression of concern. He invited her into his office, a calculated move designed to isolate vulnerable customers. The walls were adorned with certifications and awards, many of questionable origin, all intended to establish a veneer of authority and expertise. "Mrs. Willis," Rick began solemnly as they sat down, "I'm afraid your vehicle has some serious issues. Johnson, my master technician, found significant damage to your camshaft assembly. There's also potential timing chain damage and several valves that need replacement." He paused for effect, watching for signs of panic in her aged eyes. Margaret's face remained unchanged, not even a flicker of distress. "I see," she said calmly. "And what's causing these problems in a car with such low mileage?" The question was pointed, but her tone remained conversational. Rick missed the warning signs, too fixated on the financial opportunity sitting before him. "Well, it's hard to say exactly," Rick hedged, reaching for his rehearsed explanation. "Could be a manufacturing defect, poor maintenance by a previous owner before you purchased it, or just bad luck. Modern vehicles are complicated machines. Sometimes parts fail prematurely. Just the nature of the beast, unfortunately." The lies flowed smoothly, practiced and polished. Margaret nodded thoughtfully, her eyes never leaving Rick's face. "And what would be the cost to repair these issues?" she asked, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The perfect picture of a helpless elderly woman, or so Rick thought as he prepared to spring his trap. Rick slid a printed estimate across the desk, watching eagerly for her reaction. $4,875.36, he announced, the number calibrated to sound precise and therefore legitimate. "That includes parts, labor, and a rental car while we complete the work. I know it's substantial, but you can't put a price on safety, can you?" For just a moment, Margaret stared at the paper. Her silence made Rick uncomfortable, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Then she looked up, her eyes suddenly sharper than before. "This is quite detailed," she observed. "Would you mind walking me through these specific repairs? I'd like to understand exactly what's happening with my vehicle." Rick shifted in his seat, unprepared for such a direct request. Most customers, especially older ones, simply accepted his expertise without question. "Well," he began, scrambling to remember the specific lies Johnson had suggested. "The camshaft assembly is damaged, which is affecting valve timing. That's causing the knocking sound you hear." "And you're certain it's the camshaft?" Margaret pressed, her voice taking on a new edge that made Rick glance up from the estimate. "Not something simpler, like a loose heat shield, perhaps?" The question hung in the air between them, oddly specific, unexpectedly informed. Rick forced a condescending smile. "Mrs. Willis, I understand this is confusing. Car problems often are to the uninitiated, but I assure you we've done a thorough diagnostic. This isn't a simple heat shield issue." His voice took on a paternal tone, designed to placate and dismiss, a tactic he'd used countless times on women her age. Something changed in Margaret's demeanor then. She sat straighter, her shoulders squaring as she reached into her purse. Rick expected a checkbook. Instead, she withdrew a neatly folded stack of papers. That's interesting, she said, because according to the Toyota Technical Service Bulletins, this particular model has a known issue with heat shields becoming loose around 25,000 miles. Rick's smile faltered. Well, we checked that, of course. The issue is much more serious, I'm afraid. His confidence began to crack as Margaret unfolded her papers, printouts of engine schematics and service bulletins, covered in handwritten notes with mechanical precision. This wasn't in the script. Elderly women weren't supposed to arrive armed with technical documentation. Mr. Thompson, Margaret said, her voice now firm and clear, I spent 43 years as a mechanical engineer for NASA, specializing in propulsion systems. Before that, I got my doctorate from MIT focusing on internal combustion engines. She laid the papers between them like cards in a winning hand. Now, would you like to reconsider your diagnosis? The air in the small office seemed to vanish. Rick's mouth opened, then closed, no words emerging as he processed this dramatic shift. The frail old woman had vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous, expertise. His mind raced, searching for a way to salvage both the scam and his reputation. There must be some misunderstanding, Rick stammered, his confident facade crumbling rapidly. Johnson must have, perhaps we should take another look. Sweat beaded on his forehead as Margaret continued to stare him down, her expression unnervingly calm. The hunter was suddenly, inexplicably, becoming the hunted. I think that would be wise, Margaret agreed, her tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. And while your team is taking that second look, perhaps you could explain why you're charging $1,200 for a camshaft that retails for $340. Or why you've allocated 8 hours of labor for a job that the factory service manual specifies takes 3. Rick's collar felt suddenly tight as he tugged at it nervously. Mrs. Willis, there are factors that go into pricing that aren't always obvious to customers. Overhead costs, specialized tools, warranty considerations. The excuses sounded hollow even to his own ears as they tumbled out in desperate succession. Margaret smiled then, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Thompson, I've designed systems that had to function flawlessly in the vacuum of space. I've managed 9-figure budgets and teams of hundreds. Please don't insult my intelligence by suggesting I can't understand basic business economics or automotive repair pricing. The silence that followed was deafening. Something cold settled in Rick's stomach as he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. This wasn't just a customer catching him in a lie. This was someone who could potentially destroy everything he built. His reputation, his business, perhaps even his freedom, if she pursued legal action. I'd like my keys back, please, Margaret said finally, breaking the tense silence. And I'd like to see my car immediately. The request was simple, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. Rick nodded mutely, rising from his chair on suddenly unsteady legs. This situation was spiraling beyond his control at an alarming rate. As they walked through the garage toward her Camry, Rick's mind raced, calculating damage control. Johnson looked up from another vehicle, his expression curious at the strange procession. Rick's ashen face, Margaret's determined stride. Something had clearly gone very wrong with their usual routine. Johnson, Rick called, his voice higher than usual. Mrs. Willis would like to inspect her vehicle. The Camry we were discussing earlier. The coded message was clear enough. Abandon the scam, cover your tracks. Johnson's eyes widened slightly as he wiped his hands on a rag and approached cautiously. Of course, Johnson replied, glancing nervously between Rick and Margaret. We were just about to run some additional tests to confirm our initial findings. The lie was transparent, especially now that Margaret's true expertise had been revealed. She simply raised an eyebrow, saying nothing as she moved toward her vehicle. The Camry sat in the center bay, hood still open, tools scattered around it in a theatrical display of work that had never actually happened. Margaret approached it like a detective arriving at a crime scene, her eyes methodically scanning everything. The positioning of tools, the conspicuous absence of actual disassembly, the pristine condition of components that were supposedly failing. Interesting, she murmured, leaning in to examine the engine compartment. For a camshaft in need of replacement, everything looks remarkably intact. No disassembly, no diagnostics equipment connected. Her fingers traced along the edge of the heat shield, finding exactly what she suspected. A slightly loose mounting bracket that could be tightened in minutes. Rick and Johnson exchanged panicked glances as Margaret straightened up, fixing them both with a penetrating stare. Would either of you care to explain what actual work has been performed on my vehicle today? Because from what I can see, the only thing that's happened is the creation of a fraudulent estimate for repairs that aren't needed. Now, Mrs. Willis, Rick began, his voice taking on a placating tone that sounded hollow even to his own ears. These things require proper diagnostic time. We wouldn't start disassembly until receiving authorization from you. The excuse withered under her unwavering gaze, trailing off into uncomfortable silence. Yet you were confident enough to quote specific parts failures and nearly $5,000 in repairs? Margaret countered, her voice level but cutting. Either you have X-ray vision, Mr. Thompson, or you're running a scam, and not a particularly sophisticated one at that. Around them, the other mechanics had stopped working, the garage falling silent as the confrontation unfolded. Johnson took a step back, already distancing himself from the situation. Rick stood alone now, his usual smooth confidence shattered as he realized the audience this confrontation had attracted. Not just his employees, but several customers in the waiting area had become aware something unusual was happening. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Rick tried again, lowering his voice. Why don't we go back to my office and discuss this privately? I'm sure we can come to an arrangement that satisfies everyone. The desperation in his tone was evident. This needed to be contained before it became a spectacle. Margaret shook her head slowly. I don't think so, Mr. Thompson. I'd prefer to stay right here where your employees and customers can hear exactly what kind of business you're running. Her voice carried clearly through the now silent garage. In fact, I think they deserve to know how many other people you've defrauded with these tactics. One of the younger mechanics, a man barely in his 20s, shifted uncomfortably nearby. His eyes darted between Margaret and Rick, then down to the floor. Margaret noticed immediately. Young man, she called to him, how long have you worked here? And how often have you seen this kind of diagnosis performed? Before Rick could intervene, the young mechanic spoke, his voice quiet but audible in the tense silence. 3 years, ma'am, and pretty regularly, mostly on older folks or women who come in alone. His admission hung in the air like exhaust fumes, toxic and unmistakable. Several customers in the waiting area exchanged alarmed glances. That's enough, Taylor, Rick snapped, his face reddening with a dangerous combination of embarrassment and anger. Mrs. Willis, I won't stand here and be accused in my own business. Either we resolve this privately, or I'll have to ask you to leave the premises immediately. The threat was empty. They both knew she wasn't going anywhere. Margaret's expression remained unchanged, her composure absolute. Mr. Thompson, I have 3 options for you right now. First, you can fix the actual problem with my car, the loose heat shield, at no charge. Second, I can call the police and file a formal complaint for attempted fraud. Or third, I can walk out and take my documentation to the local newspaper. Rick's face drained of color. The stakes had escalated beyond a single unhappy customer. This was existential. He'd built his business on these practices, gradually increasing their boldness over the years as he faced no consequences. Now everything teetered on the edge of collapse because he'd chosen the wrong target. Mrs. Willis, please, he said, his voice losing its edge, be reasonable. This is my livelihood. I have employees who depend on me, a family to support. The plea sounded pathetic, even to his own ears, a desperate attempt to evoke sympathy from a woman he'd been ready to defraud just minutes earlier. You should have considered that before you attempted to scam an elderly woman out of nearly $5,000, Margaret replied, unmoved. How many others have there been, Mr. Thompson? How many people on fixed incomes have had to drain their savings because of your diagnoses? Her questions hit like precision strikes, each one finding its mark. By now, several customers had moved closer, abandoning any pretense of not listening. One elderly man stepped forward, his face furrowed with suspicion. I paid $3,200 last month for a transmission rebuild, he said, addressing no one in particular. You told me it was completely necessary, couldn't be repaired. His voice trailed off as he looked to Margaret. Margaret nodded encouragingly to the man. And I'd bet good money it could have been repaired, sir. She turned back to Rick, whose options were diminishing by the second as more customers began murmuring among themselves. The situation was spiraling beyond containment, witnesses multiplying with every passing moment. "Check the heat shield," Margaret said to the young mechanic named Taylor, completely bypassing Rick now. "Show everyone here what's actually causing the noise in my vehicle." Her tone was kind but firm, an invitation the young man couldn't refuse, especially with so many eyes now watching the unfolding drama. Taylor hesitated, glancing at Rick, who stood frozen in indecision. Then, making his choice, the young mechanic grabbed a ratchet and leaned into the engine compartment. After less than a minute of work, he straightened up. "It's just a loose mounting bracket on the heat shield, ma'am. I've tightened it. Should be fine now." "And how much would that repair normally cost?" Margaret pressed, her eyes still fixed on Rick's increasingly pallid face. Taylor shrugged uncomfortably. "Parts? None. Labor at our shop rate? Maybe $30 tops. It's a 10-minute fix." His words landed like nails in the coffin of Rick Thompson's reputation. The murmurs from the gathering crowd grew louder, more indignant. Another customer stepped forward, a middle-aged woman, clutching her purse tightly. "I paid over $2,000 last week for a fuel system cleaning and new injectors," she said, her voice trembling with rising anger. "Was that another scam?" Rick finally found his voice, though it had lost all its previous authority. "Now wait just a minute. Everyone calm down. We run a legitimate business here. Sometimes mistakes happen in diagnostics, but we've always..." His protests were drowned out by the growing chorus of suspicious customers, each suddenly questioning their own expensive repairs. Margaret observed the chaos with the calm detachment of a scientist watching a controlled experiment unfold. She hadn't planned this public exposure, but she couldn't deny its effectiveness. Years of exploitation were unraveling in minutes as the community Rick had systematically defrauded found their collective voice. One particularly incensed customer had already pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the Better Business Bureau right now," he announced loudly. Another chimed in, "The Attorney General's office has a consumer protection division. My nephew works there." The threats were no longer hypothetical. They were imminent and multiplying. Rick's eyes darted desperately around the garage, seeking an escape route from this nightmare. His gaze landed on Margaret, and for the first time, he saw her clearly. Not as a vulnerable mark, but as the architect of his undoing. How had he missed it? The intelligence in those eyes, the precision in her questions. He'd been blinded by his own prejudice. "Everyone please," Rick pleaded, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Let's not be hasty. If anyone feels they've been overcharged, we can review your invoices. Customer satisfaction is our priority." The words rang hollow, transparently false against the backdrop of what had just been revealed. No one was buying it anymore. Margaret finally moved toward her car, retrieving her keys from the workbench where they'd been carelessly tossed. "I believe my vehicle is repaired now," she said, her voice cutting through the growing commotion. "But I don't think I'll be leaving just yet. These people deserve answers, Mr. Thompson. And it seems I'm not the only one you've targeted." The crowd had grown to nearly a dozen disgruntled customers now, their collective anger creating an almost physical pressure in the confined space of the garage. Rick was backed against a toolbox, his usual commanding presence diminished to that of a cornered animal. His employees stood apart, none willing to stand beside him. "This is ridiculous," Rick sputtered, a last desperate attempt to regain control. "You can't all just believe the word of one woman over a business that's served this community for 15 years. We have certifications, credentials." He gestured wildly at the wall of framed certificates, as if paper could shield him from the consequences of his actions. A business built on exploiting people's trust and lack of technical knowledge isn't serving the community, Mr. Thompson. It's parasitizing it, Margaret replied, her words cutting through his bluster like a precision tool. "And I suspect if we examine those credentials closely, we'd find they're as fraudulent as your estimates." A new voice joined the fray, older, authoritative, belonging to a man in his 70s who had been silently observing from the waiting area. "I'm Raymond Geller, the former head of the Chamber of Commerce," he announced, stepping forward. and I've heard enough to warrant a formal investigation into these business practices." Rick's face went from red to ashen in seconds. Raymond Geller was a pillar of the community, his word carrying weight with every business owner and official in town. If he was calling for an investigation, others would follow. The situation had escalated beyond anything Rick could control or contain. "Mr. Geller," Rick managed weakly, "surely there's no need for anything formal. As I was telling everyone, if there are concerns about past repairs, we can review them individually and make any necessary adjustments." The desperation in his voice was palpable now, his confident facade completely shattered. Raymond Geller shook his head slowly. "I've heard complaints about your shop before, Thompson. Always dismissed them as competitors spreading rumors. Now I see the truth was staring us in the face all along." He turned to Margaret with newfound respect. "Ma'am, I believe you've done this community a great service today." The atmosphere in the garage had transformed completely. What had begun as a routine scam had morphed into a public reckoning. Customers were exchanging contact information, comparing invoices, building a case in real time. The younger mechanics huddled together, distancing themselves from their boss, whispering about what this meant for their jobs. Johnson, Rick's loyal accomplice who had remained conspicuously silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Boss, maybe we should close up for the day. Get legal advice." His suggestion came too late. The damage was spreading beyond containment, witnesses multiplying, evidence accumulating with every shared story. Rick nodded numbly, the fight draining from him as the reality of his situation became unavoidable. His eyes met Margaret's across the chaos of the garage floor. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why go to all this trouble? You could have just taken your car elsewhere, reported me quietly. Why this?" He gestured at the scene unfolding around them. Margaret considered him for a moment before answering. "Because people like you count on silence, Mr. Thompson. You count on shame and intimidation keeping your victims quiet. You count on isolated complaints being dismissed as misunderstandings." Her voice remained calm, matter of fact. "You count on people like me walking away." The truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. His entire business model had depended on exactly that: isolated victims, too embarrassed or uncertain to challenge his authority, each believing they were alone in their experience. Margaret Willis had changed the equation by refusing to be silent, by making the private public. "Look," Rick said, lowering his voice to a desperate whisper, "there must be something I can do to make this right. Name your price. Whatever you want. Free repairs for life, cash settlement, anything. Just help me get these people to stand down." The offer was naked desperation, a drowning man clutching at straws. Margaret's expression hardened, the last vestiges of her grandmotherly demeanor falling away completely. "That's your solution? More dishonesty? More exploitation? You still don't understand what's happening here, do you?" She shook her head, disappointment evident in every line of her face. "This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Thompson. It's a reckoning." As if on cue, the distinctive wail of police sirens became audible in the distance, growing steadily louder. Someone had called the authorities, perhaps Raymond Geller, perhaps one of the increasingly agitated customers. Rick's eyes widened with genuine fear as he realized this had escalated beyond civil complaints into potential criminal territory. "You can't do this," he hissed at Margaret, panic rising in his voice. "It's your word against mine. I've got connections in this town, people who depend on me. One old woman can't bring down my whole operation over a misunderstanding." The desperation in his tone betrayed the hollow threat behind his words. Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her purse and withdrew a small digital recorder, holding it up for Rick to see. "I started recording the moment I walked into your office, Mr. Thompson. Every word of our conversation, your admission about the heat shield, your inflated estimate, all of it captured clearly for the authorities." Rick stared at the device, his last hopes of damage control evaporating. Margaret had outmaneuvered him at every turn, anticipated his moves before he made them. The recorder was the final piece in a trap that had been closing around him since the moment she first walked through his door. The police sirens stopped abruptly as two patrol cars pulled into the parking lot outside. Through the open bay doors, Rick could see officers emerging, their expressions serious as Raymond Geller immediately approached them, gesturing animatedly toward the building. This was really happening. His carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. "Mrs. Willis," Rick said, his voice barely audible now, "please, I have a family, kids in college. This will destroy everything." It was his last appeal, a desperate grab for sympathy from the very woman he'd attempted to victimize hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Margaret's expression softened slightly, though her resolve remained unchanged. "You should have thought about your family before you built a business on fraud, Mr. Thompson. Actions have consequences. That's something engineers understand very well. Every system eventually fails when built on a faulty foundation." The officers entered the garage, their presence immediately commanding attention. The crowd parted to allow them through, voices rising as multiple customers attempted to explain the situation simultaneously. One officer raised his hands for quiet, while his partner approached Rick directly, expression grim. "Mr. Thompson?" the officer asked, though it was clearly a formality. "We've received multiple complaints about fraudulent business practices. I'm going to need you to answer some questions." He glanced around at the assembled crowd, the open hood of Margaret's car, the damning estimate still clutched in Rick's trembling hand. Rick looked desperately around the garage, at his employees who stood apart, unwilling to defend him, at customers whose trust he'd exploited for years, at Margaret Willis, standing calmly at the center of the storm she'd unleashed. There was no escape route, no clever explanation that could undo what had been exposed. "This is all a misunderstanding," Rick attempted weakly, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The evidence was too substantial, the witnesses too numerous. For the first time in his career, the consequences of his actions were catching up to him, accelerating beyond his ability to outrun them. The officer remained professionally detached as he began asking specific questions about Margaret's vehicle, the estimate, and the actual repairs performed. Each answer Rick gave only seemed to deepen the hole he was in, his explanations increasingly convoluted and inconsistent as he tried to justify the unjustifiable. Meanwhile, the second officer was taking statements from customers, each account adding to the growing evidence of a pattern of fraudulent behavior. The young mechanic, Taylor, had stepped forward too, reluctantly confirming that this was standard procedure at Thompson Auto Repair, finding minor issues and turning them into major invoices. Margaret stood quietly observing, her mission essentially complete. She hadn't come seeking vengeance or even justice in the abstract. She'd simply refused to be victimized, refused to allow her knowledge and expertise to be dismissed because of her age or gender. The broader consequences had unfolded organically from that single act of resistance. As the officers finished gathering initial statements, one approached Margaret directly. "Ma'am, your testimony will be crucial if charges are filed. Are you willing to make a formal statement down at the station?" His tone was respectful, acknowledging her central role in uncovering the scheme without the condescension Rick had shown her hours earlier. "Of course, officer," Margaret replied without hesitation. "I'd also like to offer my technical expertise if it would help evaluate other potentially fraudulent repairs. 43 years of engineering experience might be useful in building your case." The officer nodded gratefully, recognizing the value of such an expert witness. Rick watched this exchange with mounting despair, the full extent of his downfall becoming clearer by the moment. Not only had he lost the respect of his community and the trust of his customers, he was now facing potential criminal charges with the very woman he'd attempted to scam volunteering to help build the case against him. One of the officers returned to Rick, his expression somber. "Mr. Thompson, based on these statements and the evidence presented, we're going to need you to come down to the station for further questioning. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the Miranda rights continued, Rick's shoulders slumped in defeat. Around him, his business, built on exploitation and dishonesty, was unraveling completely. Customers were demanding refunds, employees were collecting their tools and walking out, and community leaders were already discussing who might take over the garage once the dust settled. The officer guided Rick toward the patrol car, his former arrogance replaced by stunned silence. Johnson, his longtime accomplice, was being questioned separately, his face ashen as he realized his own complicity might have legal consequences. The house of cards was collapsing all at once, years of deception exposed in a single afternoon. Before being placed in the patrol car, Rick turned for one last look at his garage. His gaze found Margaret, who stood watching with the calm certainty of someone who had simply done what was right. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, predator and prey, roles now dramatically reversed in a way he never could have anticipated. As the patrol car pulled away, Raymond Geller approached Margaret, extending his hand in respectful gratitude. "Mrs. Willis, I can't thank you enough for what you've done today. This man has been taking advantage of our community for years. It took someone with your expertise and courage to finally stop him." Margaret accepted the handshake with a modest nod. "I simply refused to be taken advantage of, Mr. Geller. The rest happened because others found their voices too." She glanced around at the crowd still gathered, sharing stories of their own encounters with Rick's fraudulent practices. One exposed lie had created space for many truths to emerge. The young mechanic, Taylor, approached Margaret tentatively. "Ma'am, I want to apologize. I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I needed the job and—" He trailed off, clearly struggling with his own complicity in the scheme. "I should have said something sooner." Margaret regarded him thoughtfully. "What matters is that you spoke up today when it counted," she said finally. "Sometimes the hardest part of doing the right thing is recognizing when you've been doing the wrong thing. What will you do now?" The question wasn't accusatory, it was an invitation to consider his path forward. Taylor straightened his shoulders slightly. "I'm a good mechanic, ma'am. A real one. I know how to fix cars properly, honestly. I just got caught up in this." He gestured around the garage, his expression resolute. "But I'm going to find somewhere else to work. Somewhere I can be proud of what I do." Margaret smiled, seeing something in the young man that reminded her of former colleagues, talented people who sometimes needed redirection rather than punishment. "This town needs honest mechanics," she observed. "Perhaps when the dust settles, you might consider coming back. This garage won't stay empty for long, and someone with integrity will need to run it eventually." As the crowd began to disperse, several people approached Margaret to shake her hand or share their own stories. She listened patiently to each one, occasionally offering technical insights that confirmed their suspicions about past repairs. Word was spreading through the small town like wildfire, about Rick's arrest, about the elderly engineer who had exposed him. The local newspaper reporter arrived within the hour, notebook in hand, eager to interview the woman at the center of the story. Margaret answered his questions with characteristic precision, neither embellishing nor downplaying what had happened. "I simply applied the analytical skills I've used my entire career," she explained. "Engineering is about finding truth in systems." By evening, Margaret finally drove her perfectly functioning Toyota home, the slight knocking sound completely gone after Taylor's simple repair. As she pulled into her driveway, her phone was already filling with messages, from friends who'd seen the news, from community members she'd never met, from the district attorney's office requesting a formal statement. Inside her modest home, Margaret made herself a cup of tea and settled into her favorite chair, reflecting on the day's events. She hadn't set out to dismantle a fraudulent business or become the center of a community uprising. She'd simply refused to be dismissed, refused to have her knowledge and experience discounted because of her age or gender. 3 weeks later, Thompson Auto Repair reopened under new management. The sign above the door now read, "Willis & Sons Honest Mechanics," a partnership between Margaret, who provided the initial investment and technical oversight, and Taylor, whose genuine skills and desire for redemption had impressed her during their conversations following Rick's arrest. The garage quickly developed a reputation for fair prices and transparent service. Margaret instituted a policy of educating customers, explaining repairs in clear language, showing them the actual problems, even offering monthly workshops where people could learn basic maintenance. No one would be exploited due to lack of knowledge. Not on her watch. Rick Thompson eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Margaret's recording, the testimony of former employees, and the documentation from dozens of customers who had been overcharged for unnecessary repairs. His sentence included restitution to former customers and a 5-year ban from the automotive industry. For Margaret, the new venture wasn't about profit or even justice in the abstract. It was about using her lifetime of knowledge to protect her community, especially those who were vulnerable to exploitation. At 73, she'd found an unexpected second career as the town's mechanical guardian angel, turning wrongs into rights, one repair at a time. The story spread beyond their small town, featured in regional papers and industry publications. Other repair shops found themselves under increased scrutiny as customers, emboldened by Margaret's example, began asking more questions, demanding more transparency, refusing to accept technical jargon as an excuse for inflated bills. Margaret kept the framed invoice from that fateful day, the nearly $5,000 estimate for a repair that had ultimately cost nothing, hanging on the wall of the garage's waiting room. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "Knowledge is power. Never be afraid to question." It served as both warning and promise to everyone who entered. On quiet afternoons when business was slow, Margaret could sometimes be found in the garage bay, sleeves rolled up, guiding Taylor through the intricacies of complex repairs or sharing stories from her NASA days. The lessons she taught went beyond mechanics. They were about integrity, about standing firm when it matters, about the quiet power of expertise wielded in service of truth.